I'm Mark Ramsey. I am so excited to talk to Rob Selkowitz because it's not every day I get to actually interview someone who's been to ComicCon, just like me. You know, usually we don't interview each other. We just walk by other people or interview each other. Rob is the author of a fabulous book called, and I actually have a paper copy, Rob. Look at that. It's actual live paper. ComicCon in the business.
Excellent. Good on you.
ComicCon in the Business of Pop Culture, subtitle, which is really the subtitle is what's relevant to this conversation more than anything. What the world's wildest trade show can tell us about the future of entertainment. Now, by the way, I must comment, Rob, you know, if I had your signature, it would be a much higher value collectible at auction.
I will be down in San Diego in less than 2 weeks' time. If you happen to pick me out of the crowds of hundreds of thousands, I would be happy to sign any and all books.
Well, let's talk about that, because you're absolutely right. There are hundreds of thousands there, and I think any reasonable broadcaster who looks at this interview says, what in the world does Comic-Con have to do with my world? I mean, I agree with you that there's an undercurrent of relevance that's, you know, huge there. But can you explain what the world's wildest trade show can tell us about the future of entertainment?
Well, just stepping back and looking at it, first of all, from a marketing perspective, right now the hottest thing in marketing is you're not just trying to get consumers for your product, you're trying to get fans. You're trying to get raving fans who love your product, who will go out there and be your ambassadors to the marketplace. Well, let me tell you, the fans don't come any more raving than they do at the San Diego Comic-Con. And this has been the case in the comics industry for more than 50 years. They've actually been able to inspire hordes of ordinary people to get so involved in the stories that they're telling and the characters that they've created that they think nothing of flying across the country, dressing up as their favorite characters, and wandering around for everybody to see, trumpeting how much they love this stuff. Now, wouldn't that be amazing if other entities out there in the world could somehow tap into some of that energy? But one of the things that Comic-Con tells us is that the relationship between producers and their raving fans is not always straightforward, that there's a lot of complexity that goes along with that. There's a lot of sharing ownership of your brands and products that goes along with that. And part of my purpose in telling the book from a business perspective was to infuse that conversation about turning consumers into fans with a little bit of get real. You know, Comic-Con has raving fans, and sometimes it's a little problematic.
Indeed it is. Yeah, that sub-theme is really the context for this conversation. You point out a bunch of, you know, themes for business readers that are characteristic of the comics business and of entertainment in general. I just want to read through them real quick because they're relevant for radio broadcasters. Number one, complexities of a global transmedia environment. Check. Number two, disruptive changes in the delivery distribution platform. Check. Number three, generational change within the audience and the business. Check. Number four, entrepreneurial innovation, putting pressure on incumbents. Check. Number five, tension between centralization and democratization in the creative industry. Check. I mean, all of these are characteristic not just of the comics industry and comics culture, but of entertainment at large, television, film, music, radio. How do we navigate that world that you just outlined? You outlined all these issues. What do we do about it?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's actually refreshing to talk about the business side of this book. What I found is that a lot of the business people want to talk about comics, and a lot of the comics people kind of want to talk about business, but they really want to talk about comics. So this is actually where some of my prior experience comes in. I've written about some of these subjects in the past, especially in terms of entrepreneurship and globalization and generational change. These are big things that are shaping the world that we're living in, and no industry has full control of where this stuff is going. And I think the biggest mistake that a lot of people make when they're trying to do strategic planning for their business or their industry is to lock down on a set of certainties about the things that they think they know about where everything is going and say, okay, we know that millennials act this way, and therefore if we want to cater to them, we have to adjust our business model in these ways, that sort of thing, as if it's a the trend gives us date certain for when changes are going to happen. And part of my work as a futurist is to look at this stuff in a sort of broader way and say, keeping in mind that all of these are the forces that are pushing in particular directions, where they may fall out for your particular industry could be in a couple of different ways. And the most prudent kind of planning looks at a broad spectrum. It says, you know, what do we do in an expanding market? What do we do in a contracting market? What do we do in a market where these forces of centralization are where the innovation is coming from? In other words, it's the big guys that are calling the shots, versus a world where most of your innovation and interesting things are happening at the grassroots level. And these define very different worlds and very different sort of future scenarios. So in the last chapter of ComicCon and the Business of Pop Culture, you know, there's a whole sort of practicum on this scenario planning method about how you can look at changes that are shaping your industry in a broader way. That's the shorter answer of saying I'm not here to provide all the answers. The best I can hope for is to provide better questions.
Yes, and which is the ultimate consultant's cop-out response, Rob, let's face it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in that final chapter...
Get me on the clock, I'll give you answers.
in that final chapter, you your guidance is essentially to say, pick two dimensions, right? And each of those dimensions has two extremes, and just plot those extremes against each other, and you end up with 4 quadrants, and you can kind of assess the reality of each of those 4 quadrants, knowing that the reality really is probably going to be some mix of the above, right? It's not like in the radio case. It's not going to be that radio goes away. It's not going to be that radio is what it was 20 years ago. It's going to be some, you know, different kind of experience where we've got Pandora, where we've got online radio, where we've got experiences that live in the real world, where radio companies re-envision themselves as local marketing companies and help their clients do a better job of reaching their consumers. All of these things are going to coexist to one degree or another, right?
Exactly. And what that scenario matrix does is if you define your polarities properly and you've got sort of the extremes at either end, this can serve as almost a compass, so that as you're walking in one particular direction and you sort of know what lies at the end of that particular path, you can say, okay, so we're dealing with consolidation. That means, you know, we're likely to see, for example, more agitation for intellectual property protections as legislation, versus if we're going toward a more bottom-up model, and we're likely to see more sort of mobilization around freer use of copyrights and collaboration around content and things like that. So there are certain sets of things that travel together, and when you sort of know the direction that you're going in, you can start forming those groupings and you can start seeing around the corner a little bit better.
I'm intrigued by a few of the things you wrote in here. One of the points you made is about the kind of traditional, old-fashioned, if you will, comics shop. And you make the point that I think applies well beyond the perimeter of a comic shop, and that is that they're not in the business of selling comics. They're in the business of selling an experience around comics. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because certainly in my business of radio, if you're a broadcaster, you're not just in the business of, I don't know, selling listeners or selling airtime or selling content. You're in the business of an experience around all that, and I'm curious about what that might look like.
Well, first of all, this was sort of an epiphany that I had a few years ago at ComicCon, because I'm sort of a collector and an old school fan myself in certain ways. And I was going around to the dealers and I was looking at the books, and I discovered that most of the books that interested me personally on some level were things that I already had or couldn't afford or whatever. And yet, instead of walking away from that part of the show, I realized that I actually got a lot of enjoyment just out of the experience of going through the boxes, of talking with the dealers, and that at the end, I would buy something just as my ante at the table for saying, thank you for letting me, have that experience. And I know that's not like the traditional shopper's mindset. Maybe I'm a little more self-conscious about this stuff, but it sunk in that that's really what separates fandom from consumerism. And that whatever your industry, that consumers come and go, and it depends on how much money they have to spend, it depends on how much time they have to spend. A fan is there for something else. They're there for more than the transaction. And if you can give them that extra something that they're looking for, you can give them that sense of belonging to a community, that sense of connectedness to things that they cherish, that any of these intangible things, that people will spend the money just to be in the presence of that, and it has value to them. You're delivering a a valuable experience. You're not cutting corners. You're not economizing in ways that make them feel cheated afterwards. Everybody leaves happy when you can provide that kind of experience as a provider, and everybody as a consumer will be happy to give you your business if that's what you're providing.
Here's where I think we get into trouble in the radio business. You know, we have fans. We also have this broader group of listeners who are not fans. And in fact, the ratings folks judge us not so much by the number of fans we have as by the total mass of listeners and the amount of time they spend, a lot of which is passive and not necessarily passion-based. What you just said was fans are there for an experience beyond the transactional. And I wonder, isn't part of the answer here, if you're a broadcaster and you have assets, to focus on doing things for those fans which are more than just what you do for every other listener, creating new experiences? I mean, for example, public radio creates producers clubs where people pay $1,200 a year so that they can have experience in the halo, in the presence of the brands they love. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes, it's something like that. It's actually, NPR has done a really good job of creating a brand ambiance that people want to be part of. And I think there's other aspects of radio. I mean, I think that talk radio listeners are the closest approximation in mass media to the fans at ComicCon. I mean, there are legions of people with great devotion and loyalty to particular hosts and particular sets of ideologies around that can be mobilized in all kinds of stuff. If the host writes a book, they'll buy the book. If the host, goes on TV, they'll watch the TV show. So building up these brands that provide that sense of community, I think, is something good. You have to be careful of cults of personality and things like that. I mean, there's other dangers that lurk at the edges. But if I might, one of the points that you mentioned in the lead up to the question points to some of the other work that I've been doing, which is that in the digital economy that we're in right now, a lot of our old productivity quantitative metrics are insufficient to capture the value that's being created and capture the kinds of transactions that are going on. And one of the long twilight struggles that I'm having with a lot of my corporate clients is around creating a richer set of qualitative metrics that better capture how this experience works and how you as a business are serving your best customers and creating something that is portable beyond the next quarterly targets, beyond the next set of numbers, and something that you can really build on.
You mention a word in this book frequently, and it's a word that in radio circles hasn't been heard much, and that word is transmedia. Can you talk about what you mean by that and how that might apply to my world?
I think it's ironic that radio isn't in on the transmedia thing, in that radio was probably part of one of the more successful earliest experiments in transmedia. What transmedia is basically it's taking a story that originates in one format or medium and extending that story across different formats and different media as a way of capturing new audiences or a way of keeping audiences engaged. And one of the great early examples of this was Little Orphan Annie, right? The newspaper comic strip that appeared in the paper would have a code that you would then have to listen to the radio broadcast to decode the message, and then you would have bonus content added to the value of reading the comic strip. And is that really that different a model than, say, pointing an iPhone at a QV code somewhere and getting bonus content around the digital comic book? It's the same model. It's the same idea of taking aspects of that story and aspects of that experience and bringing it somewhere else. So I think radio could be a part of that if they think a little bit broadly about their model.
That's interesting, because what you're getting to with the transmedia notion, though, is that, and you have the line in here somewhere, I highlighted it, it's that nowadays the content and the fans of that content don't want to be wed to any particular distribution platform, right? They are multi-platform out of the box, and they expect their creations and their creativity and their products and their services to live across platforms. And your point about transmedia is that their existence across platforms is not the same thing in every platform, right? It takes on a different chapter or a different flavor or a different look, a different feel across platforms, right?
Exactly. And what you need to do to be successful about this is not just think about what makes the property successful. because then you run into what I call in the book the Hall H problem. Hall H is the room in the Comic-Con Convention Center, the 6,500 seat bedroom where the relationship between movies and comics is consummated in public, as I said in the book. And that gives rise to all kinds of weird distortions because the movie people that are turning comics into movies want to please the fans in that room. And what the fans in that room want to see is the most accurate representation of what's on that comic book page that they love. Why? Because to them, the comics is the original platform. And everything else is the version of that. And so we want high fidelity in the version as it goes from comics to movies. The problem is if you make a movie that is too faithful to the comic book source material, it's going to look ridiculous as a movie. And again, I would hark back to the, in the distant mists of history of radio, that one of the most successful media adaptations ever of anything was was Orson Welles' adaptation of War of the Worlds. And he didn't stand there and read the book on the radio. He conceived of it in the format of radio news announcements and things that people were accustomed to hearing on radio to tell that story. And it was a brilliant reimagining of the source material, and it created a sensation. So that's a great example of, thinking beyond where the material comes from, thinking beyond the story, and thinking what does my medium in particular have to offer to that story and have to offer to the audience.
All right, final question. Favorite Star Wars character?
Darth Vader.
I'm a Yoda man myself. Rob Salkowitz is the author of a terrific new book called ComicCon and the Business of Pop Culture, conveniently coming out a matter of just a few weeks before Comic-Con in San Diego. Rob will be there. I hope to be there. We'll see. It's awfully crowded. The subtitle is the important part, What the World's Wildest Trade Show Can Tell Us About the Future of Entertainment. Rob Salkowitz, thank you so very much.
Thank you.